wanted to talk about Jefferson and why I think he continues to resonate. This book was published the week after the election in November. I've been blessed with a remarkable response to it. A number of people who have really wanted to talk about Jefferson, often Mr. Jefferson, as if he's about to come by for a drop-off. In Virginia, they still think he's coming for dinner. They're not aware of the whole death thing. But I think the reason he resonates, the reason from age to age he repays our attention, is that he embodies and represents the best of us and the worst of us. That there is a part of Jefferson who articulated best the promise of what the country could be, and in his own life, he fell dramatically short of all that he ought to be. And I think when we're all being honest with ourselves, we all know that at least the second part of that is a fairly common part of the human condition. And so I believe he resonates because of this seeming cognitive dissonance, but actually I think they're related. Light and dark, in his case, were inextricably bound up together. And he did not live entirely in the light or entirely in the dark. Like a lot of us, he lived in the twilight. But his twilight, when it was brighter than it was dark, changed history and bent the life of the West and the life of the world, really, in the right direction. So I want to talk about the best of us, the worst of us, and see if y'all have any questions. Here's the most important significant thing to me about Jefferson is that he was a politician. From 1769 until 1809, he was almost constantly in public office. He was the most successful politician of the early republic if you judge it by the raw standards of the keeping and holding of power. From 1800 to 1840, either Thomas Jefferson himself or a self-described Jeffersonian was president of the United States. FDR didn't do that, Lincoln didn't do it, Reagan has not done it. The one person who might still is Bill Clinton. It is possible. We are 20 years into an era where he has been every Democrat who's won has either been him or needed to hire him to make the case, as you'll recall. In fact, President Clinton is still campaigning for President Obama. I don't know who's going to tell him it's over, but and it breaks his heart. So it is possible that this could continue. And let me tell you someone who's very excited about that possibility. Hey man, you mean I could be Jefferson? Would be the basic thing. With his marshaling of power, he did it not simply for purely Machiavellian reasons. There was some of that, obviously. He was human. But one of the important things about that era, and that I think repays our attention to it, not that history should be an antidepressant. It shouldn't. You know, we should not look back and say, oh, if only things could be like that, if only we could have people like that again, we would be in better shape. Because people like that then were like us now. My sense is that we do not learn from the past when we look up at people adoringly or down on them condescendingly, but when we look them in the eye. And when you look Thomas Jefferson in the eye, what you see is someone who struggled all the time with the better and worse impulses of his nature. The best impulse was his insight that what had been going on in the West for the previous 200 years, between the Protestant Reformation, the translation of Scripture into vernacular, the rise of Gutenberg, and the Enlightenment idea that prelates and princes should not control our destinies, but that individuals were ultimately responsible for the fate of their own souls and the course of their own lives, and therefore should be trusted with the government of themselves. That was the central insight that the American Revolution embodied. We fell short in woeful ways, as we still do. But it was the first time in human history when that insight was taken to its logical extreme in terms of politics and of culture. And that's what Jefferson was doing. He believed in two things more than anything else. Well, three. He liked good wine. He believed in good wine. And he believed in the sense that authority was not granted by absolute divine sources to anyone to rule over anyone else. That what was given by the divine power, the laws of nature and of nature's God and our Creator, as he put it, was individual rights. And that our rights created a kind of sacred space in which neither the hand of a king nor the hand of a mob could come in and take them away. And so that insight embodied in the Declaration was a new and really is the controlling reality of the American experience. And he had this. He knew it from college. He went to liberal arts college. Those of us who love liberal arts colleges should point to Thomas Jefferson. He learned it at William and Mary. He read and was beautifully educated. And he understood that this was, in fact, the right way to proceed politically as well as ethically and culturally. He was also a genius at compromise. So if you think that he represents the best of us in the sense that he took what had been a vertical society that had been ordered from kings and nobles and priests and popes, sorry guys, that authority had been given to them automatically, was becoming horizontal. And Jefferson was an architect of that horizontal vision. But it was not, in and of itself too, it was not absolute. He was not an idealist. He was not a utopian-driven man at all. He believed in the art of compromise. He believed in getting things done. He had that great combination of skills, which we've been incredibly lucky in the United States. You know, Charles de Gaulle said, for some reason, the Lord God above loves drunks, little children, and the United States of America. And for some reason, we have gotten through everything, despite our best efforts sometimes. As Churchill said, Americans always do the right thing when they've exhausted every other possibility. He knew that, it is, as he put it is best to give as well as to take in a system such as ours. He said that the ground of liberty is gained by inches. You know, Robert Penn Warren once said that history, like nature, knows no leaps except the leap backward, maybe. There's a lot of truth in that, and I think it's something that in historical terms should serve as a way to lower all of our collective blood pressures when we are frustrated by the lack of progress in the political realm as you and I may define progress. When the system feels as though it is not commensurate with our needs, with what we want from it, it's important, I think, not to give up or to give in to anger, but to recall that, in fact, this is the way it's always been, and that we haven't found a better way to do it yet. There may be one, but we're working on our third century now of having found this way of working things out. Jefferson believed in compromise. It was not a dirty word to him. Compromise does not mean capitulation. It can mean that, but it doesn't automatically. He did not believe that every political struggle should be seen as a Manichaean ultimate test of the republic or of the party. Problems could be solved. You gave as well as you took, because that's the way human experience had taught him would best serve the interests of the country. That is something we've lost in recent times. One of the problems with being historically minded is it's very easy to be cynical and blasé about things. Something will happen. My new favorite verb, to sequester. Now, is it to sequester or to sequestrate? Which gets into castrate, which gets into a whole different part of the Old Testament. But when we see these things, it's easy for people like me and people like you to say, oh, well, you know, the Black Plague was pretty bad, you know, or Fort Sumter was terrible. Just because something is happening now, just because something has happened before, doesn't mean it's not happening now. But it does require, I think, some proportionality. What is different today than in Jefferson's time, and even, I would argue, in the 1980s, is that because of technology and because of the nature of how districts are drawn, there are only about 40 swing districts left in the United States. You don't worry, if you're an office holder now, you don't worry about the general election, you worry about the primary. It's my other favorite verb, to be primaried. I shall have been primaried. I don't know how you subjugate that. But how members of Congress now do not worry about November. They worry about earlier on, and they are less likely to give the president or the opposite party a vote or two, which they used to do, because of the fear that the base at home will be whipped up by the local talk radio person of the left or the right, and then drive a new person in to run against them for being impure, ideologically impure. Thomas Jefferson knew that there was no such thing as practical philosophical purity. If you want to be a philosophical purist, politics is the last place to go. Absolute last. I can think of anything else. Business, you know, you can stand on principle and decide whether you want to make a deal or not make a deal and pay the price. But politics, because it's all about our common destiny, has to be driven by compromise. And Jefferson was an architect of a culture in which compromise happened. It was not Valhalla. This is not a prelapsarian vision of American politics. Put yourself, if you would, imaginatively for a second, in 1790, in New York, the infant capital of an infant republic. George Washington has become president on the 30th of April, 1789. Alexander Hamilton has become Secretary of the Treasury. Jefferson has just come back from France to become Secretary of State. He comes to New York. He can't find rooms on what he calls the Broadway, but gets rooms on Maiden Lane and immediately goes to war against Hamilton. These two conflicting visions. They are, as Jefferson put it, like two cocks in a pit, constantly at each other. Washington dislikes this strife, so he writes a letter to both men, asking for a certain peace. The letter said this: "How unfortunate it is that whilst we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, that we should be allowing internal dissensions to harrow and tear our vitals." Harrow and tear our vitals. It's a wonderful image. Not a common thing in George Washington's rhetoric, as noble as he was. Clearly, he was deeply disturbed by this partisanship. Here's how well it worked. Jefferson wrote back to the president of the illegitimate son of Nevis, his colleague, the Treasury Secretary, "I will not suffer the slanders of a man whose history, at the moment history can stoop to notice him, is a tissue of machinations against the liberty of the country, which has not only received him and given him bread, but heaped its honors upon his head." So that Dr. Phil moment did not work out. Hamilton wrote back saying that Jefferson was an atheist in religion and a fanatic in politics. And an anonymous letter writer from New York in those days wrote Jefferson saying, "I think you ought to get a damn kicking, you redheaded son of a bitch." So, I know some of you all want to think Karl Rove started all this. Karl wants you to think he started all this. I know, I asked him. I said, "Do you want people to think?" "Yeah." But partisanship has been a perennial aspect. The question is not how do you get rid of it, it's how you manage it. How do you manage and marshal partisan feeling in a practical way to create coalitions of opinion that resolve commonly agreed upon problems for a certain amount of time? That's the definition of the practicalities of democracy. It's not going to ever be perfect. Never. That's for Lee and his colleagues to worry about. That's the city of God. The city of man is forever flawed. And the sooner, I think, and the more fully we recognize that and appreciate it, the more sensible, I think, our common conversation can become. That's certainly what Jefferson believed. Jefferson believed that the life of the mind and the life of politics should not be in opposition. In fact, they were contiguous states with very porous borders.